Good afternoon, scaredy cats. Hope you enjoy the video today and please like, comment, and subscribe. Crazy lady. Bob had been out in the woods all day, hunting for deer. When he got back to his little cabin, it was almost dark and he was shocked to find the front door was standing open. Cautiously, he crept into the cabin and was surprised to see a young lady standing in front of the fireplace. She was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. She had a really pretty face and long brown hair that came down to her shoulders. She was wearing a white vest that was tied up over her stomach and a pair of blue jeans that accented her curves. The young lady said her name was Jessica and she was lost. She had come out to the woods to stay at her father's lodge, but had wandered off and couldn't find her way back. She said she had spent all day wandering in the forest, trying to find help. Bob said that he would help her, but it was too late to go walking through the woods. She would have to stay the night in his cabin, and in the morning, he would lead her back to her father's lodge. Jessica thanked him and offered to cook him dinner in return for his kindness. Over dinner, they talked for a while and Bob was glad to have company. He didn't meet many women, living alone as he did, in his little cabin in the woods. Eventually, Jessica started to get sleepy. It was almost 2 o'clock in the morning. Bob told her she could take his bed and he would sleep in a chair. She climbed into bed, fully dressed, and before long, was sleeping soundly. She looked like she needed the rest. Bob watched her as she slept. He thought she was one of the most gorgeous girls he had ever seen. He wondered if she could fall in love with a man like him. She was the kind of woman he had longed for all his life. Young, brown-haired, and beautiful. As Jessica slept on the bed, he sat in a chair, listening to music on the radio. He kept the volume low so that he wouldn't wake Jessica. Then, just as he was dozing off, the music on the radio was interrupted by a local news broadcast. The reporter said that the police were combing the area in search of a prisoner who had escaped from the state hospital for the criminally insane. Bob's ears pricked up. The reporter said that the woman who had escaped was armed and dangerous. She had been convicted of the grisly murders of her husband and 4 other men and was sent to prison. Psychologists who examined her declared her mentally ill, and she was transferred to the state hospital for the criminally insane. However, as she was being transported, she managed to overpower her guards, using a knife she had stolen from the prison cafeteria. She stabbed them to death and escaped into the woods. The police had been searching for her all day. On the radio, they gave a description of the crazy lady. She was 5'4", 26 years old, brunette and very attractive. She had been wearing a prison uniform when she escaped, but they said she would probably try to steal some clothes to disguise herself. The police warned people to be on the lookout for the crazy lady and advised anyone who came across her to keep their distance. Bob's blood froze as he looked at Jessica, lying there peacefully on his bed. She fit the description perfectly. Young, brunette, beautiful, and completely insane. She was the escape maniac the police were looking for. He was sure of it. And he was sure of something else too. She was planning to kill him while he slept. He wasn't going to let that happen. He knew what he had to do. Suddenly, Bob jumped out of his chair and threw open the front door of the cabin. Jessica awoke with a fright and looked at him, a confused expression on her face. He grabbed her by the hair, pulling her out of bed, and began dragging her towards the door. She started screaming and her arms flailed wildly, trying to catch hold of him. He managed to wrestle her to the front door, then with a mighty heave, he threw her out into the darkness. She landed on the grass outside and immediately jumped up and came running back towards the door. Bob slammed the wooden door shut and had just enough time to lock and bolt it before she slammed into it. He braced himself against the door, expecting her to break it down at any moment. He could hear her outside, pounding on the cabin door with her fists, kicking it with her boots and shouting at him to let her in. And then he heard a scream, an ear-splitting shriek that made him shiver. It sounded like the howls of a crazed animal. The kind of sound that could only be made by a person who was completely insane. Then there was a horrible silence. He could hear something shifting and moving about outside the wooden door. He was shaking with fear, ready for anything. After a while, he noticed a thin trickle of blood coming under the door. Soon, it turned into a pool of blood, flowing across the floor at his feet. Gathering his wits about him, Bob slowly opened the front door and was horrified by what he found. Jessica was lying there in a pool of blood and a large knife was sticking out of her head. She was completely naked and her eyes were glazed over. His mind raced as he tried to understand the strange scene that lay before him. But, stranger still, was the neat pile of blue clothing which was sitting on the grass beside Jessica's dead body. Reaching over her naked corpse, he picked up the blue clothes and, turning them over in his hands, he realized it was a blue uniform. There was some black lettering printed on the back. It read State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. He fell to his knees beside the dead girl's body as he finally understood what had happened. The crazy lady had murdered Jessica for her clothes. A friendly phone number. Annalisa bought a new address book. As she was writing the names from the old book, she noticed her friend's name. Linda had died several months ago. She felt silly transferring the name to the new book, but she felt a little strange to just ignore it. She knew she was being a bit morbid, but something was telling her to dial that number. Maybe to know and hear that it didn't belong to her friend anymore might bring some closure to her. She was having trouble dealing with the grief that was with her almost daily. Much to her shock, Linda answered. Taken aback, she stuttered the beginning of a conversation. In no time, they were talking like the old friends they were. The last several months were especially hard for Annalisa. In addition to losing Linda, her fiancé left her, so she used the opportunity to pour her heart out to Linda. In doing so, the bitterness and hurt she felt lifted from her soul. Linda asked why Annalisa hadn't called in so long. Why hasn't Bruce called? Linda cried. He promised to always be there for me. Bruce was the driver of the car that took Linda's life. He was driving her home after her bridal shower, and the shower gifts were packed not only in the trunk but high in the back seat, blocking the back windows. They were to be married in just 3 short weeks. Bruce was injured in the accident and had been in a deep coma since that day. He knew nothing about Linda's death. Annalisa was thrown off guard. How do you answer such a question? Linda continued, why haven't you called all these long months? Why hasn't Bruce called? She asked this over and over. Not knowing what else to say, she gasped, because you died. Annalisa heard no reply. All she heard was the dial tone. Her heart was pounding in her ears as she hurriedly dialed the number again. No answer. Old lady. The policeman sat on the sofa with his pen and notebook in his hands. The old lady came in with a cup of tea and set it down on the table in front of him. Before you take me down to the station, perhaps I should tell you why I did it, officer, she said. The truth is, it was mostly for the company. It gets very lonely when you're an old lady and young people never seem to want to spend any time with me. I enjoy just sitting and talking. The policeman stared at her impassively. Mrs. Ordway was the very first, she said as she sat down in her comfy armchair. I remember it like it was yesterday. She came to my door selling beauty products. I invited her inside and made her a cup of tea. I went to the kitchen and fetched my axe. Then, when she least suspected it, I crept up behind her and chopped off her head. The next one was Mr. Bilgeman. He was a plumber and he came to fix my leaky pipes. While he was taking a break from his work, I made him a cup of tea. Then, I took my axe out from behind the sofa and chopped off his head too. The third one was the paper boy. Little Jimmy Watkins. I told him to come inside while I looked for my purse. He didn't drink tea, so I gave him a plate of cookies. Children can't resist cookies. While he was munching away on the cookies, I began chopping with my axe and his head came off as well. I stuffed all the heads and placed them on my mantelpiece. I talk to them. Day and night. I carry on conversations with them. It helps with the loneliness. The only problem was what to do with the bodies. I couldn't stuff them all. It would have been too much work. So, I came up with an ingenious solution. What did I do? It was simple. I stuffed one body and used it for all of the heads. When I was tired of talking to one of them, I would take off the head, put it back on the mantelpiece, and put another head on the body. Isn't that clever? The policeman didn't answer. Well, I'm getting a little bored with our conversation, officer, the old lady said with a sigh. She stood up, took off the policeman's head, and put it back on the mantelpiece. Then, she took down the saleswoman's head and placed it on the body. Oh, good afternoon, Mrs. Ordway, she said. It's so nice to see you again. How have you been? Late husband. There was a young woman who was never lucky in love. Every boyfriend she had either mistreated her or cheated on her. She was beginning to think she would never find a husband and worried that she would spend the rest of her life alone. Then, one day, she met a young man who swept her off her feet. He was kind, gentle, and caring. They began dating and gradually fell in love. When he asked her to marry him, the young woman was delighted. She immediately accepted. After the wedding, the couple moved into a little house in the suburbs and together they began making a life for themselves. They had to work hard in order to make the payments, but they didn't mind because they had each other. The young woman was delighted with her life and thought her happiness would never end. One night, she was waiting for her husband to come home from work. It was getting late, and when he still hadn't arrived, the woman began to get worried. She called his mobile phone, but there was no answer. Eventually, she grew tired and decided to go to bed. As she drifted off to sleep, the woman had a horrible nightmare. In the dream, she saw her husband riding his motorcycle down a darkened road. Suddenly, he swerved into the path of oncoming traffic and crashed into a truck. She watched in horror as the motorcycle skidded along the road and the truck ran over her husband's body. In the twisted wreckage, she saw his mangled corpse lying in a pool of blood. She woke up in a cold sweat and her heart was beating fast. OMG, she cried. He's dead. He's dead. Sitting up in bed, she tried to calm herself down. Looking at the clock on her bedside table, she realized it was a little after midnight. Just then, she heard the familiar sound of her husband's motorcycle pulling into the driveway. As she listened closely, she heard the front door open and her husband's cheerful voice telling her that he was home. He started to explain why he was coming back so late, but the woman interrupted him. "You're really late," she shouted from the bedroom. "Why didn't you call? I was so worried. I thought you died in an accident." Downstairs, there was an eerie silence. She strained her ears to listen. Then, she heard her husband say, in a faint voice, "So, you've made your choice then." Again, all she could hear was silence. The woman called her husband's name again and again, but there was no reply. She got out of bed and went downstairs, but the house was completely empty. Her husband was nowhere to be seen. Minutes later, the phone rang, and when she answered it, there was a policeman on the other end. "I'm sorry to be the one to inform you," he said, "but an hour ago, your husband was killed in a motorcycle accident." A funny kind of day. Ever heard of Funny Town, USA? No, not the one from Colorado, the one from Idaho. If you haven't, that's okay, because it's no longer there. It hasn't existed since the summer of 1968. Funny Town was an amusement park that only lasted for less than a month. Anyone who remembers it would probably recall hearing a news report that a tragedy occurred there that forced the park to close down. I am one of the few still alive today who actually saw what happened. My name is Josh Henriquin, and I will tell you everything I witnessed. It was Friday, July 18th, 1968, and the park was the busiest it had ever been, according to the local news. I arrived there with my best friend Luke and his fiancée Mel. Luke and I were 17, and Mel was 16. I hadn't seen them for nearly a year since they moved in together, and when Mel bugged Luke to take her to Funny Town, he gave me a buzz and had me tag along. Us two guys felt too old for some kiddie park, but it was Mel's birthday, so we went along with the idea. We entered the park, which was fairly crowded for being a place that was so out of the way. It was a large, cartoonish town with cast members wearing striped, brightly colored suits and blouses. There were many booths set up along the streets with typical amusement park shit like unhealthy food and games for winning prizes. As you'd expect, Luke felt obligated to win Mel some prizes, which gave me some time to roam around on my own. I remember deciding to go on a ride that Mel would have hated, Dr. The Stranger's Funny House, a cheap knockoff of Disney's Haunted Mansion. Only one person could go at a time, and the rider had to sit in an uncomfortable mining cart. I sat in that damn cart, and it moved me along on a track through a pitch-black tunnel where animatronic ghosts, mummies, and vampires popped out at me. It wasn't anything impressive, but then the cart took me into a room where the figure of Dr. Strange stood. The scene depicted was one that really stuck with me. Dr. Strange was dressed in typical Mad Doctor fashion and stood in his laboratory. A giant, deformed monster he had created was locked in a cage, begging for food. The crazed doctor was standing over a female victim that was strapped to a table, and he was hacking her up with an axe, feeding her body parts to the monster. Although the scene was done with cheap animatronics, I had no idea it was really an omen for what would happen next. The ride ended, a cast member pulled me out of the cart, and I was in a black tent. As I walked towards the opening, I suddenly heard what sounded like an alarm. I exited the tent and saw that everyone was in a panic as the noise continued, yet there didn't seem to be any signs of danger. Some people headed back to the parking lot, while others stood there acting very confused. Even the people in charge of the park didn't know what the fuck to do. That's when everything got very, very terrible. The alarm had a horrible effect on some people, and it started with the cast members. One by one, they began to rip the flesh from their faces clean off, then guests began to do the same. Those that were faceless began shouting the most insane things I've ever heard to something in the sky. The alarm continued to sound, and those that had not mutilated themselves were brutally attacked by the crazy ones. Chaos erupted all over Funny Town, and blood covered pavement and soaked into the grass, creating huge puddles that some people slipped on while trying to get away. Those who were once holding hands were now impaling and hacking away at each other. I was so paralyzed by fear that I could not fucking move till I saw someone on fire running directly at me. I kicked him to the ground, then ran through the mob of gore-drenched maniacs to see if I could save my friends. Finally, I found my best friend that I had known since preschool. Mel was crawling away in agony with her throat sliced open. Luke was about to finish her off with a shard of glass when he turned around to reveal that he had torn off his face as well. He smiled at me and said, "They're coming to save us, Josh. All we have to do is free ourselves from this ugly flesh, and they will accept us." "Who, Luke?" I asked. "Who is coming?" Suddenly, the alarm started getting louder and louder until I saw that it wasn't an alarm at all. The horrendous noise was emitting from a spacecraft that swooped down over Funny Town, then hovered for a few minutes while the people that had lost their minds called to it, begging the unseen aliens to take them away. Instead, the craft began to slowly fly off. The base of the ship was circular, and the top was pyramid-shaped, with 3 triangular engines on its back that glowed blue. As it flew back into space, the noise slowly began to fade, then the entire crowd became completely silent for a few short moments. The eerie silence was soon broken by a dozen police cars arriving at the park's entrance. The officers were all heavily armed, and 2 SWAT teams quickly joined them. The police opened fire on the crowd, targeting literally everyone. I left Mel and Luke behind, and took cover in the tent from the funny house, where I was attacked by the cast member who had helped me off the ride. The man was strangling me, but I was able to kick him out of the tent. I saw him get back up, but then a shotgun shell made his head explode. I laid there in my hiding spot with my eyes shut, listening to the horrors outside and praying no one would look inside the tent. Obviously no one did, but I still waited there for many hours, hardly moving at all till I heard the chirp of crickets. Night had come, and all the police vehicles were gone, so I left the tent and made my way back to my car, stepping over dead bodies and cruelly made weapons as I walked through the dark streets of the once happy park. That's where my story ends, and it's all true. There were other survivors of the massacre, such as other guests and officers, but most of them either killed themselves or went missing. The entire park was torn down the next day, and the government covered the whole thing up, especially the appearance of the UFO, as you can imagine. To this day, I have no idea why the sound from the spacecraft made some of the guests crazy, but not all of them. It probably made me a little crazy too, because whenever I think about that day, I do find it funny. A hollow realization. When my grandmother died, I was on the cusp of 28. My memories of her were bittersweet and lingered somewhere between fondue parties and a not-so-subtle disdain for my mother. Despite this, I was heartbroken when I lost her. Maybe it was guilt in having not spent enough time by her bedside. Maybe it was seeing a piece of my own childhood die as well. Maybe that's why she keeps coming to visit me. It's been twice now. The first time, I was paralyzed with fear. Who among you wouldn't be after seeing your grandmother appear exactly as she did the day she died, mouth slightly open, the pain of a 4-year battle with cancer still present despite having finally receiving her so-called sweet release? When she disappeared, I was all too certain it was a waking nightmare. This explanation pacified me, but on a more visceral level, I knew it was a load of shit. Something wasn't right. The second time it happened, I was clutching my windowsill and trying desperately not to vomit after yet another night of binge drinking. My grandmother appeared beside me. I knew she'd arrived, but I was too petrified to look this time, and I didn't have to. I could feel her presence, and I knew she wasn't there to comfort me. Sooner or later, I had to turn around if I ever wanted to leave the bathroom. The urge to vomit was replaced by fear, and each breath I took was more cumbersome than the previous. I faced her, and that was when I saw her burst into flames. Her arms were outstretched, and her head was rotating in a grotesque carousel-like fashion just slow enough for me to make out her features, which were contorted in pain. I vomited everywhere, and she disappeared. I slowly shimmied my back down against the cool tile of my bathroom wall and laid down. Never before had I felt equal parts shame and fear, even as an alcoholic. There is something fundamentally wrong with my life, and in a post-puke moment of rare clarity, I understand this. But there is something wrong with my grandmother's afterlife, and I am not sure what to think about that. I pondered telling my mother, but why? She didn't shed a single tear when her mother died, and in a true Pappas family fashion, it's likely I will carry on that tradition at her funeral, too. 2 days passed without a visit, and I was starting to return to normal. I succumbed to my desperate lifestyle that I tried to pretend was alluring and chic. My previous moment of clarity disappeared faster than the plastic seal around the bottle of bourbon I was about to nurse for the next several hours. I lifted my glass to my lips and they began to burn. I closed my eyes in ecstasy. This was the first drink I'd had since the incident, and it was everything I needed in that moment. I tipped the glass all the way back, and it hit me. Not the glass, the realization. It hit me so hard my entire life passed before my eyes in an instant. Wasn't this supposed to happen only to those who were dying? I started to hyperventilate. I learned the purpose of my grandmother's visits. She was in hell, and she wanted to tell me something. My grandmother, a virgin until marriage. My grandmother, a tri-weekly Catholic church attendee. She was in hell for eternity, and if she's in hell, what chance have I got of not joining her one day? Bay window. One cold winter night, a 16-year-old girl named Brittany Snow was home alone, watching TV. Her parents had gone out to a dinner party at a friend's house. It had been snowing heavily all afternoon, but Brittany felt nice and snug as she sat on the sofa in the lounge, tucked up under a warm, fuzzy blanket. By midnight, Brittany's parents were still not home, and she began to feel uneasy. She didn't want to call them, in case they thought that she couldn't take care of herself. The television was in the corner of the room, right next to the big bay window. She was watching one of her favorite movies, a horror film named Prom Night, when suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something moving in the bay window. Through the darkness and the falling snow, she could make out the figure of a man, walking towards the window. As he got closer, she was able to make out his face, and it filled her with horror. The man's face was hideously scarred, his eyes were wild and crazy, and he seemed to be grinning maliciously at her. Frightened, Brittany pulled the fuzzy blanket over her head and tried to hide. She hardly dared to move. Slowly, she pulled the blanket aside just enough to peer out with one eye. The man was still there. He was just standing there, staring directly at her as the snow fell behind him. Then, he reached into his coat and pulled something out. It was a long knife. Terrified, Brittany pulled the blanket back over her head and hoped that the madman would think it was just a pile of blankets sitting on the sofa. She managed to move her hand slowly over to her pocket and took out her mobile phone. Pressing the buttons in a panic, she dialed 911 and held her breath as she waited for an answer. When the operator asked, "What is your emergency?" Brittany put the phone close to her face and whispered, "There's a man outside my window. He's got a knife. Please come quickly." She sat motionless under the blanket as the minutes ticked by. Eventually, she heard sirens outside and the police started banging on her front door. Brittany pulled off the blanket and rushed to the front door, letting the 2 police officers inside. They said they had seen no trace of anyone outside her house. "He was right there," said Brittany, pointing out the bay window to her snow-covered front lawn. "That's not possible," said the female officer. "There couldn't have been anyone standing out there. The snow is completely undisturbed. If there was someone out there, they would have left footprints." "But he was standing right there, staring straight at me," said Brittany. "I saw him with my own 2 eyes." "You know, your eyes can play tricks on you," said the male officer. "Maybe you've been watching too many scary movies." The officers turned to leave when, all of a sudden, the female officer stopped dead in her tracks. She pulled back the sofa that Brittany had been sitting on. Her jaw dropped and her eyes widened in shock. Brittany and the male police officer gasped. On the carpet behind the sofa, there was a trail of wet footprints and a discarded knife. "You weren't looking at the man outside the window," said the female officer. "You were looking at his reflection. He was standing right behind you all along." "Shadows. There's a monster under my bed." "I know. I saw it once when I peeked. And 2 green eyes looked back at me and blinked. I don't know what it looks like, it's never there when the lights are on. Sometimes I hear it growl, other times it purrs like a kitten. But it's the moments of silence that scare me most because that's when I know it's thinking about me. And it's silent now. Daddy said I just have bad dreams. But I know that's not true because I don't dream, and it always happens before I go to sleep." When I tried to tell him that, he just shouted, "William, go to bed." When Daddy doesn't call me Billy, I know he's mad at me. There's a shadow in the corner. It only appears when the lights go off, when the voices come. It stands there and stares at me with red eyes. It touched me once, reached inside me, and grabbed my heart. I froze and couldn't move. Daddy turning on the light saved me that day. I never felt so cold, not even when there's snow. I wonder if death is cold. It laughs, and it's not a nice laugh. It's all hollow and echoes in my ears and inside my head. Mommy said I have a vivid imagination. But then the shadows took her and Daddy away. I never heard them scream like that. Seeing the shadow was better than hearing the screams. The shadow now leaves the corner, coming closer. And the monster? The monster is not under the bed anymore. It's now on my chest, purring, mouth open, ready for its meal. I want to get up and run, but I can't. There's a buzzing in my brain, and everything is numb. The voices are now everywhere, but I can't hear what they're saying. The shadow reaches into me one last time. A dream analysis. There's a reoccurring dream I've had 4 times now. It always starts the exact same, but ends differently. The main part of the dream goes as follows. I'm walking along a sidewalk by a speedway near my old neighborhood with homes on the left-hand side and businesses on the right. It's pitch black, and not a single car passes by. Where I'm walking to is unclear. On the opposite side of the speedway walks a skinny man dressed completely in black with a hoodie. He turns his head at me while still walking, and it's clear that he's wearing a white, latex mask. I suddenly become uneasy because he doesn't look like someone I'd want to meet, especially at night, and he's aware of my presence. At this point, I decide it's best that I turn around and go back to my old house. I stop walking, and the strange man turns away and continues moving forward, to my relief. I stand there for a few seconds until the man is far off in the distance, then I turn around and walk back to my home. Suddenly, I hear footsteps from behind me. I look out the corner of my eye and see that the man is following me and getting very close. My heart begins to pound, and I quicken my pace, wondering how he got behind me so fast when he was so far away from me on the other side of the street just a second ago. After a few moments of panic, I decide it's time to face this person and see how much danger I'm really in. I turn around to find a young boy, probably middle school age, wearing a backpack. Surprised, I say hi to the boy, which he says in return, then walks ahead of me towards a small house with its door opened. An eerie blue light shimmers from the opening. Before going inside, the boy looks back at me and invites me in. I politely refuse, then continue on my way through the darkness. As I get further away from the boy's house, it quickly becomes apparent that the blue light is the only light source that can be seen, but I trudge onward. My destination is the house I had grown up in, so finding my way through the dark shouldn't be a problem. I take a left up a short hill, then a right across a street, knowing my house is just around the corner. After another hill, I'm sure I've found my home, but I soon realize that I'm wrong. I don't see my house anywhere, and there are no lights on in the entire neighborhood. Unsure of what to do and getting freaked out, I start running, going as fast as I can, and I would never stop till I found my house in the dark maze I was in. That's where the first dream in this series ends. The second dream goes the same way right up until the part where the boy invites me into his house. This time, I agree to go inside and get to know him. When I enter the house, I find that the blue light had been coming from a TV screen the whole time, with a Sonic the Hedgehog game being played by his younger brother. I'm instantly greeted by his mother, and his father is in the kitchen making popcorn. While the inside of the house isn't very spacious, it still looks cozy with a long, comfortable couch and a recliner in the living room. Without really talking much to the family, I sit down to play my favorite game from back in the day. I play against my new friend, and then with his brother. After a while, the family starts to seem a little too friendly, and an uneasy feeling creeps over me. Things get even more uneasy when the loving mother of the family brings out a plate with cigarettes piled on top and passes them around to her kids. The kids are way below the legal smoking age, but the mother lights up their cigarettes for them anyway, and they begin smoking with delight. Even as an adult, smoking is something I've never been too fond of, but I take a cigarette anyway, as to not be rude. Once finished, I thank the family for their generosity and get up to leave. The last thing I remember is the mother arranging candles on a table and lighting them. In the third dream, I enter the house and play Sonic the Hedgehog just like before, but the part with the cigarettes doesn't happen. However, the scene with the candles does, and the father stands in front of the TV, holding a book with an upside-down cross on the cover. He opens the book and begins reading passages in a very dark tone. The next thing I know, the 4 family members start hovering a couple inches off the ground. They float around the entire house, and the younger brother floats up a short flight of stairs to his bedroom, laughing as he does so. Meanwhile, I'm still sitting on the couch watching all of this, and I'm paralyzed with terror. Even though they were all smiling and having fun with their powers, I was too afraid to move. My fear of what they might do to me kept me from trying to escape, and I awoke from that dream screaming. For the 4th and final dream so far, the family didn't smoke cigarettes or hover in the air like before. Instead, they all sat together on their couch, staring at a blank screen and not speaking or even moving. I was standing up, looking in horror at the man in the latex mask sitting inside the cozy house on the recliner, holding a shiny combat knife. Before I woke up, all I saw after that was darkness, followed by the family members screaming as they were being stabbed repeatedly by the man I had encountered in dream number 1. Now for the dream analysis. A doctor, whose name I can't reveal at this time, was able to make me realize that the man in the latex mask is me. The boy I meet on the sidewalk is Stephen Chaney, my old friend. His mother is Megan, Father Lewis, and Brother Morgan. In all 4 dreams, I take on the role of my younger self, and the killer is the person I would later become. On August 13, 1996, I killed the Chaney family. I've been in prison for a long time, and after 10 years, I developed amnesia and simply forgot about that incident. It wasn't until I started having these dreams that everything came back to me. Before you decide that you hate me, hear me out first. The ability to float in the air was just one of the many things the Chaney family were capable of. They weren't possessed by spirits, they were just evil. Evil incarnate. They could move objects and operate electronics with their minds, hold flames without getting burnt, and they practiced sacrifice and got away with it. I remember hanging out with Stephen all through middle school and most of high school, always at his house. His family seemed so nice, but through all those years, he had been giving me little hints that they were gifted. It was on the last day we hung out that they revealed their flying powers, and I never spoke to him again after that night. Although too afraid to ever go back, I would go out at night on missions to spy on them. It was on these missions that I witnessed the horrible things I mentioned earlier. A couple years went by with me doing nothing about this evil presence that lived so close to my house with my loving parents. I tried to put it out of my mind, and went forward with my plan of going to college and living in a dorm room. While in college, I spent a lot of my time in the library, reading about the occult. What I read confirmed what I saw on my spying missions, and action had to be taken. I couldn't go to the police, I knew I had to go it alone. On August 13th, I drove my fairly new car back to my old neighborhood to stay the night at my parents' house. When they had fallen asleep that night, I snuck out wearing a hoodie and a latex mask, and made my way towards the Chaney house. I cut their power, then crept in through their unlocked back door to find them standing in their living room in confusion. I rushed at them with a knife my dad had kept from his days in the military, and I was able to kill them all, starting with the father and ending with my old friend Stephen. I savored their death screams, and when it was over, and I was walking back home, that's when the cops came. The screaming of those demonic bastards had been loud enough for the police to show up, and 2 of them tackled me to the ground and threw me in their squad car before I could run home. My crime was all over the news the next day. People called me disturbed, and maniacal, and crazy. No one would believe that I had saved an entire neighborhood from evil forces. Instead of a simple thank you, I got life in prison. Well, since it's almost time for my medication, I'll end this with a word of caution: only trust those closest to you. Don't just assume that most people are normal and good-natured. There are beings living amongst us that take the forms of average-looking, friendly people, and should they choose, they will harm you. If you suspect that there's something off about a seemingly normal person, remember my story. Video camera. Excerpt: Video camera is a scary horror story about a young university student who comes to believe that he is being stalked. He leaves a camcorder in his room to act as a surveillance camera. A few years ago, there was a young man named Brian who went to university. He didn't have enough money to live in the campus accommodation, so he had to rent an apartment on his own in the city. After he had been living there alone for a while, he began to notice some strange things happening. Often, when he came back from college, the curtains in his bedroom would be drawn, when he distinctly remembered having left them open when he left that morning. At other times, some of his belongings seemed to have been moved and other possessions were nowhere to be found. These strange occurrences started to creep Brian out, so the young man decided to talk to his friends, Tricia and Alex, about the situation. They met him at a local diner and, over coffee, he told them all about the strange things he had noticed. "Maybe I'm just being paranoid," said Brian. "But I just get the sneaking suspicion that someone is breaking into my apartment during the day, while I'm at university, and..." "And what?" interrupted Alex. "Rearranging your curtains and moving your stuff around? Who in their right mind would bother doing that?" "It sounds crazy, but you might have a stalker," said Tricia. "It's a possibility. If it's true, I think the best thing to do is contact the police." What can the police do? Asked Alex. They're not going to spend their time keeping your apartment under surveillance. Besides, there's no damage to any of your things. There's no sign of a break-in. In short, there's no evidence. So what options then? Pleaded Brian. I can't just do nothing. I know how you can put your mind at ease, said Tricia. It's easy. Just get a video camera, set it up in your bedroom, and leave it running when you go to college. If you really do have a stalker, you can show the tape to the police as evidence. You know, that's a great idea, said Brian. And if you're really just paranoid and crazy, you can show the tape to your psychiatrist, joked Alex. That night, Brian borrowed Tricia's video camera and brought it home. The very next morning, he hid it discreetly under some folders on his desk. Before he went to college, he pressed the record button and left the running. During the day, while he sat taking notes and lectures, the young man forgot all about the video camera. It was not until he arrived home and went into his bedroom that he remembered his plan. Taking the video camera out of its hiding place, he pressed the stop button. Then he took out his mobile phone and called his friend. Hey, Tricia, he said. I just got home. I'm going to watch the video. Cool, said Tricia. Don't hang up. Tell me if you see anything. He pressed play and watched the recording on the video camera's tiny screen. He saw himself leaving for university in the morning and closing the bedroom door. Then, there was nothing. He pressed fast forward and scanned through the video. The room was empty. Still nothing, he said. I can wait, replied Tricia. Anyway, there's nothing worth watching on TV at the moment. OMG, cried Brian as he pressed play on the camera. What? What? Tricia begged excitedly. The door's opening, said Brian. It's a woman. What's she doing? Asked Tricia. Just standing there. Closing the door. Walking around. OMG. So weird. What does she look like? Can't see her face. Long, black, stringy hair. Tattered dress. Do you know her? No, don't recognize her at all. She's carrying a knife. A big kitchen knife. She's going through my trash. Now, she's picking up my clothes and sniffing them. Ugh. Gross. What's wrong with her? She's going over to the closet. She just got into the closet. Fast forward and see if she does anything else. He scanned through the video for a while, but the room was empty. You know what this means, said Brian. I have the evidence now. I can go to the police and they'll take me seriously. I know, said Tricia. They'll have to. Alex is totally going to freak when he sees this. No doubt. He didn't believe you, but I did. I know. You're a good friend. OMG. What? What? Brian pressed play again. The door's opening again, said Brian. Who is it? Asked Tricia. Oh, it's okay, said Brian. It's just me coming home from college. He watched himself on the screen, shutting off the camera. Let's go to the police now, said Tricia. I'll go with you. We can show them the tape. Okay. I'll meet you at the diner in 15 minutes, said Brian as he grabbed the video camera. Okay. Wait a minute, said Tricia. You said she got into the closet. Did she ever leave? Brian, did she ever get out of the closet? A chill ran down Brian's spine. Behind him, he heard the closet door creak open. Brian! Get out of there, screamed Tricia, but it was too late. The phone went dead. When she tried to call him again, there was no answer. Later that evening, the police found the body of the 18-year-old college student lying in a pool of blood. He had been stabbed 21 times. The video camera was clutched in his cold, dead hands. When the police examined the camera, they discovered that the memory card was missing. No trace of the woman was ever found. Right now, she could be hiding in your closet.